It was a balmy September 15, 2022, on the sprawling campus of the University of Central Florida. The usual rhythm of academic life was interrupted by a startling report. A red golf cart had been stolen. Not just any golf cart, mind you, but the pride and joy of a maintenance technician who, upon discovering its absence, immediately contacted campus police. Somewhere on this peaceful campus lurked a golf cart heist perpetrator. Campus police wasted no time in their pursuit of answers, swiftly narrowing their focus on the first person who seemed to hold the key to solving the mystery of the missing red golf cart, Megan. Megan, a student known around campus for her sharp wit and quick retorts, had long carried a reputation for being both clever and somewhat defiant. Her natural air of rebellion, coupled with a tendency to speak her mind without hesitation, often made her a figure of suspicion in situations like these. She had an innate ability to stir up tension in even the most innocent conversations, turning them into something that felt more like a high-stakes interrogation than casual small talk. From the moment she walked into the room, Megan's casual yet self-assured demeanor radiated confidence, but it also made her seem like the last person you would want to mess with. Her cool exterior, complete with an effortless, sometimes sarcastic smile, was the perfect mask for a student who knew how to wield words like a weapon. She could take the most mundane question and respond with a sharp, deadpan delivery that left little room for further discussion. It was as if every comment she made, no matter how trivial, had a hidden agenda. However, this time, things were different. When the officers turned their questioning toward her, there was no smugness or clever retort. Instead, Megan looked genuinely taken aback, her usual bravado nowhere to be found. The casual detachment that typically defined her interactions faded as she tried to make sense of the situation. The fact that she was even being questioned about the golf cart, an object that seemed as insignificant as any other piece of campus equipment, caught her completely off guard. Despite her usual ability to navigate tense situations with ease, she found herself at a loss, clearly perplexed by the very idea that she might be involved in something so out of the ordinary. Megan's confusion was palpable, almost comical, given her usual control over every conversation she entered. The officers' questions, which were now more direct, threw her off balance, leaving her with little to say beyond what was expected. She was no longer in control of the dialogue, and for once, the sharp-tongued student found herself at a disadvantage, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable position she rarely experienced. "Me? Steal a golf cart," she repeated, her tone dripping with incredulity. "I barely have the energy to steal a parking spot, let alone a whole vehicle." Megan's response was laced with mock surprise, as though the very idea of her committing a crime was laughable. Her voice rose in pitch, emphasizing her disbelief, as if to suggest that the accusation was so outrageous that it could only be a bad joke. She raised an eyebrow for added effect, her face contorting into a mixture of feigned confusion and feigned innocence. Her eyes darted around the room as though she were looking for a hidden camera, ready to burst into laughter at the absurdity of the claim. "I barely have the energy to steal a parking spot," she added with a dismissive wave of her hand. Megan's attempt to downplay the situation was more than just a denial. It was a way to belittle the accusation itself, as if to say that even considering her involvement in such a crime was beneath her. The subtle jab at her own perceived laziness painted a picture of a young woman so uninterested in exerting any effort that the thought of stealing something as substantial as a golf cart seemed laughable to her. "Let alone a whole vehicle," she concluded, as if the mere suggestion of her being capable of such a thing was completely out of the question. It wasn't just the golf cart that was unworthy of her attention, but also the very concept of stealing itself. In her mind, such an endeavor would require energy and ambition, qualities she claimed were sorely lacking in her everyday life. Megan rolled her eyes so dramatically that one of the officers standing nearby couldn't help but chuckle. It was as if her eyes were about to roll right out of her head, so exaggerated was her disdain for the entire situation. The officer, his amusement barely contained, quipped that he might need to call an optometrist to check on her vision. The remark broke the tension for a moment, but Megan's behavior only added to the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, accused of a crime, Yet she was acting as though she were a mere bystander in some poorly written sitcom. Despite her visible discomfort and annoyance at being suspected, Megan surprisingly exhibited an oddly cooperative attitude. Instead of continuing to argue or protest, she immediately pulled out her phone, striking a pose that was almost theatrical. She swiped the screen with a deliberate, exaggerated motion, her eyes gleaming with self-assuredness as if she were about to unveil some earth-shattering secret. "You guys are looking at the wrong person," Megan declared, her voice tinged with arrogance, as she held her phone up to eye level like a tool of ultimate revelation. "Let me introduce you to the real person who took that golf cart." The scene that followed seemed almost like a mini-performance amidst the tension. Megan wasn't remotely panicked or fearful like one might expect from someone under suspicion. Instead, she maintained a cool, even slightly smug, demeanor. She pulled out her phone as though it was a trump card that would immediately clear her name, as if she were presenting the investigators with an ingenious clue in a detective novel. Rather than giving the impression that she was nervous or worried about her involvement, she looked like she was trying to one-up the entire investigation, hoping the officers would quickly realize she was not the person they needed. Her behavior made it clear that she wasn't just looking to prove her innocence, but to turn the tables entirely, casting herself as the one who held the solution to this whole puzzle. It was a bizarre, almost comical spectacle that stood in stark contrast to the serious nature of the investigation. It was as though Megan were participating in a casual social conversation, instead of standing in the middle of a police inquiry. The officers stood by, their expressions a mix of bemusement and disbelief, as Megan dialed Nina's number and hit the speakerphone button. The scene was almost surreal. Two officers, arms crossed, watching with raised eyebrows as Megan casually leaned against a nearby wall, her tone completely at odds with the gravity of the situation. She took a deep breath and, with a nonchalant shrug, began the conversation as if she were simply asking a friend to borrow a textbook. "Hey, Nina," Megan said, her voice dripping with an almost playful nonchalance, as if this were some trivial matter. It was the kind of enthusiasm one might use to announce a minor inconvenience, like a vending machine eating their dollar bill. "So, she continued, pausing for effect as she eyed the officers and their mounting skepticism, "the cops think I stole your golf cart. Care to explain this mess before it gets any worse?" Her casual delivery contrasted starkly with the seriousness of the crime being investigated. It was as though she had no concept of the trouble she was in, or perhaps she just found it amusing. The officers exchanged glances, suppressing smirks, unsure whether they were witnessing a well-rehearsed attempt at deflection or if this was just a prime example of youthful ignorance. Megan's tone, though light-hearted, only served to deepen the absurdity of the situation. The whole scene felt almost like an ill-timed prank, except this wasn't a joke. It was a criminal investigation. Megan's blasé attitude made it clear that either she was incredibly bold or simply unaware of the consequences that lay ahead. Her delivery, though deceptively casual, was razor-sharp, leaving the officers momentarily disoriented as they struggled to decide whether they were engaged in an actual investigation or merely participants in an impromptu theatrical performance. Megan's sharp wit and impeccable timing created an atmosphere of tension mixed with confusion. It wasn't just the words she spoke, it was the effortless way in which she weaved them together, a perfect blend of dry humor and nonchalance that had the officers second-guessing themselves. Was she genuinely unaware of the gravity of the situation, or was this some kind of sophisticated ruse? Her complete disregard for the seriousness of the moment created an unsettling dynamic, blurring the line between cooperation and manipulation. Yet, amid her sarcastic remarks and cool demeanor, Megan did something that none of them saw coming. She unwittingly handed them a vital clue, like a gift wrapped in a joke, so subtle that it took a second for the officers to realize they had just been led directly to their next lead. In that brief, almost absurd exchange, her offhand comments seemed to almost erase the tension, but what she failed to realize was that those very comments might be the breakthrough the investigation needed. The officers, drawn to the chaos like moths to a flame, zeroed in on their true target with a mix of practiced efficiency and bewilderment. At the center of the unfolding drama was Nina Wolfe, a 19-year-old whose presence seemed to defy reason. Nina's demeanor was a paradox, blending an air of self-assurance that one might expect from a CEO who had successfully navigated decades of corporate warfare with the naivety and reckless energy of a toddler who had just been handed the keys to a candy store. She stood before them, a mix of arrogance and oblivion, exuding the kind of entitlement one might associate with someone accustomed to getting whatever they wanted without much thought or effort. The officers couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between her confident posture and the mess she had created, the theft of a golf cart, an act that seemed utterly incongruous with her polished, almost professional attitude. Her every movement seemed to radiate an unspoken belief that she was above reproach, a sentiment that only grew more apparent as the investigation continued. There she was, standing tall, with an almost theatrical grace, completely unaware of the web she had inadvertently woven around herself. Yet, in the face of mounting evidence, it was impossible to ignore the glaring disconnect between her composed exterior and the trail of incriminating facts that all but screamed her guilt. The officers, now acutely aware of the situation, couldn't help but marvel at how Nina's bravado was as conspicuous as the stolen golf cart keys clenched tightly in her hand. The evidence was so undeniable that it didn't merely suggest her involvement, it practically shouted it, leaving no room for plausible deniability. Each piece of evidence seemed to echo with a certainty that Nina had walked straight into a trap of her own making, with an air of oblivion so thick it was almost comical. Clutched tightly in Nina's hand were the unmistakable keys to the stolen red golf cart, their bright red hue almost too conspicuous to ignore, practically glowing like a neon sign in the afternoon sun. The moment the officers laid eyes on them, there was no mistaking the connection between the keys and the missing vehicle. There was no clever hiding place for the evidence, no attempt to camouflage them. The keys almost seemed to mock the officers, daring anyone to question their origin. When the officers confronted Nina, she immediately tried to adopt an air of indifference, as if she had been wrongly accused of something far less ridiculous than stealing a golf cart. She shrugged off their pointed questions with a smug smile, her body language dripping with a nonchalance that bordered on absurdity. It was as if she thought she could talk her way out of anything, even with the glaring evidence literally in her hands. Her attempt to remain unbothered came across less as a sign of confidence and more as a poorly executed comedy skit, like someone trying to play the role of the cool, unaffected teen in a movie but failing miserably. But as soon as the officers read her Miranda rights, a formality that, in her mind, was probably more of a nuisance than anything else, her facade of nonchalance began to crack. Nina's response to the legal process was nothing short of theatrical. She met the officer's words with an exaggerated eye roll, one that seemed to convey her complete lack of respect for the gravity of the situation. The rolling of her eyes was so pronounced, so dramatic, it could have been mistaken for a scene in a high school play. Yet, despite her best efforts to maintain composure, Nina's defenses began to crumble with the grace of a sandcastle being swallowed by the tide. Each attempt to cling to her arrogance was met with the harsh reality of her own actions, until it became clear the tough girl act wasn't going to save her this time. In that moment, Nina's bravado evaporated. Her attempts to deny or justify her actions fell apart as quickly as she had tried to hold them together. What had seemed like a confident performance quickly turned into the sad and messy unraveling of someone who realized, perhaps for the first time, that there were consequences to her impulsive choices. It was a jarring contrast, her exaggerated dismissiveness replaced by the dawning realization that she was in far deeper than she had ever imagined. "All right, fine," she huffed, as if confessing to a minor inconvenience rather than a crime. "I took the golf cart. But I was hungry. Who walks to get food in this heat?" Her tone suggested that her explanation was not just reasonable but universally relatable, as though the oppressive Florida sun could absolve her of grand theft. The officers exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or continue scribbling down her absurd justification. For Nina, the golf cart wasn't a means of transportation, it was a protest against the indignity of walking in 90-degree weather. For the officers, it was shaping up to be the most bizarre confession they'd encountered in quite some time. Nina's confession was a mix of absurdity, comedy, and a touch of unsettling relatability. Her justification for the theft bordered on the surreal, She had stolen the golf cart not for some grand purpose, but simply out of pure laziness. "Do you know how hot it is out there?" she began, her tone laced with exasperation. "This Florida heat is unbearable, and our campus is way too big. I just wanted some food, okay?" As she described her plight, it was hard not to imagine her trudging across the sprawling university grounds, eyeing the golf cart as a mirage of salvation from the blazing sun. But Nina's story didn't end there. It unraveled further when the conversation turned to the keys. Her explanation, much like her initial confession, was riddled with nonchalance and a startling lack of self-awareness. "Oh, those keys," she said, feigning a casual tone while fumbling with the very clearly labeled golf cart keys. "I thought they were, like, my car keys or something." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but Nina pressed on, her gaze fixed on the keys as if they held the answers to her predicament. "Wait, these aren't for a Tesla," she blurted out, her voice tinged with genuine confusion. The officers could barely suppress their incredulity at the audacity of her statement. Was this a genuine misunderstanding or a last-ditch attempt to downplay her actions? Regardless, her remarks painted a picture of a young woman whose priorities seemed as scattered as her excuses. The mix of comedic ignorance and baffling self-importance turned what should have been a straightforward admission of guilt into a bizarre showcase of entitlement and absurdity. Reality hit Nina like a poorly parked golf cart, abrupt, jarring, and impossible to ignore. The levity of her impulsive decision dissolved in an instant as the officers delivered the news. She was being charged with grand theft of a motor vehicle. This wasn't some minor reprimand or a warning to be more responsible. It was a serious criminal offense with potentially life-altering consequences. Her bravado from earlier evaporated, replaced by a wave of panic that spilled out in the form of tears. They streamed down her face as her sniffles punctuated the tense silence in the room. She fumbled for her phone, hands trembling, and dialed the one person she thought could offer her solace, a close friend who, despite good intentions, had a knack for delivering dubious advice. Between sobs, Nina explained the situation, hoping for words of wisdom or at least a comforting pep talk. Instead, her friend's response added an almost comical layer to the escalating drama. "Just tell them you were borrowing it," the friend suggested cheerfully, as though this was a universal get-out-of-jail-free card. "That's what I do when I take my roommate's food." Nina could only stare at the phone in disbelief, unsure whether to laugh at the absurdity or cry harder at the futility of it all. Borrowing food and commandeering a vehicle were not exactly on the same legal playing field, and the officer's stern expressions made it clear they wouldn't be swayed by her friend's carefree logic. At that moment, Nina realized that her situation wasn't just embarrassing, it was spiraling completely out of control. As the officers moved to place Nina under arrest, her demeanor underwent a dramatic transformation. Moments earlier, she had shed tears and pleaded for understanding, but now she was a storm of indignation. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she shouted, her voice echoing through the quad as the metallic clink of handcuffs secured her wrists. "It's not like I robbed a bank or something. Why are you all making such a big deal out of this?" Her frustration quickly escalated, and she turned her ire toward the maintenance worker who stood quietly observing the spectacle. "Seriously? Who even uses golf carts for maintenance these days?" she sneered, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disbelief. "Ever heard of walking? Maybe you guys are just too lazy." The maintenance worker, a middle-aged man who had likely dealt with his fair share of entitled students, remained unfazed. Adjusting his cap and crossing his arms, he delivered a sharp retort without missing a beat. "Maybe you should take your own advice," he said, his deadpan tone carrying a weight that silenced the small crowd of onlookers gathering nearby. Nina, taken aback by the clapback, opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. Her face reddened as she glared at the worker, the officers, and anyone else who dared to make eye contact. The situation, however, was far from over, as her escalating outburst drew more attention, turning what could have been a quiet arrest into a full-blown campus spectacle. As the officers led Nina away in handcuffs, reality began to sink in, though her indignation only seemed to grow. The maintenance worker, tired of her careless actions and lack of accountability, had decided to press charges, a decision that visibly blindsided Nina. "This is so unfair," she exclaimed, her protests turning into a mantra as she trudged toward the patrol car. Her voice, sharp and petulant, cut through the ambient noise of campus life, a stark contrast to the muffled hum of students carrying on with their day. Her repeated complaints echoed futilely against the stern silence of the officers, who had likely heard it all before. For Nina, however, the realization stung like a personal betrayal. She cast accusatory glances toward the maintenance worker, as though hoping her dramatic display might somehow reverse the decision. The irony of her situation seemed lost on her, as did the image of the now-absent golf cart, a vehicle she had briefly treated as her personal chariot, only to have it become a symbol of her downfall. In her mind, this was less about consequences and more about what she saw as a gross injustice. As the patrol car door slammed shut, Nina's muttered protests continued, but they were now muffled behind the glass, a sound drowned out by the distant whir of campus golf carts, each dutifully operated by someone who hadn't stolen them. The officers exchanged a knowing glance, silently acknowledging that Nina's lesson was far from learned. As Nina sat slumped on the cold bench in the holding area of the police station, her indignation was palpable. To her, the situation seemed entirely blown out of proportion. Grand theft. Seriously? It's just a golf cart, she scoffed, her voice dripping with disbelief. She gestured dismissively as though to emphasize the absurdity of it all, her words aimed less at the officers and more at anyone within earshot who might share her outrage. Her tone shifted from frustration to sarcasm as she continued her tirade. "I mean, shouldn't they be arresting actual criminals? What is this, CSI, Campus Edition?" She rolled her eyes dramatically, clearly unimpressed with the gravity of her situation. The officers processing her exchanged subtle glances, unfazed by her theatrics. To them, it was just another day dealing with someone who couldn't grasp the seriousness of their actions. For Nina, however, this wasn't a moment of self-reflection but an opportunity to air her grievances. Her comments revealed a glaring inability to acknowledge the impact of her actions, on the maintenance worker who reported the theft, on the officers pulled away from other responsibilities, and on the university's community. She appeared to view the entire ordeal as an overreaction to what she considered a minor transgression. Unwilling to take responsibility, Nina's entitlement overshadowed any chance for genuine remorse. Her remarks, rather than expressing regret, showcased a blend of deflection and misplaced superiority that would only deepen the hole she had dug for herself. Nina, now officially in the hands of the law, was booked into custody. The usual routine followed as officers processed her: fingerprints, mugshot, and the inevitable paperwork. As the chaos around her finally began to subside, she was granted her one phone call, the moment she had been waiting for to somehow reverse the course of her day. But instead of calling a lawyer or a family member for moral support, Nina dialed the number she thought would offer the most comfort in the midst of this disaster: her best friend. As the phone rang, Nina muttered under her breath, "This wouldn't have happened if Uber Eats delivered closer." The words came out almost like a mantra, as if the universe itself had conspired against her, forcing her into this ridiculous situation. To her, the theft of a golf cart, the grand theft charges, the drama of her arrest, none of it made sense in her entitled worldview. Surely, her desire for a quick meal should have been enough reason for the universe to align in her favor. If only that Uber Eats driver could have dropped her food off right where she was sitting instead of making her walk all the way to the dining hall, none of this would have happened. Thus ended Nina's misguided escapade, a saga that was a perfect storm of entitlement, poor decision-making, and a complete lack of self-awareness. It was a story not of criminal masterminds or innocent bystanders, but of a young woman who believed that everything should come to her easily and instantly. She had crossed the line from irresponsibility to full-blown delusion, convinced that the world owed her an easier path to her beloved chicken nuggets. The golf cart was just the unfortunate vehicle of her misguided impatience, and the arrest, the inevitable consequence of her stubborn refusal to take responsibility for her actions. With each passing moment, it became clear. Nina was about to learn the hard way that life doesn't cater to those who expect it to. In the end, Nina's story concluded with an outcome far from pleasant. The young woman had to face the consequences of her thoughtless and impulsive actions. Although Nina may not have realized it at the time, her journey from a poor decision to being arrested revealed a clear truth. No one can escape responsibility for their choices, no matter how reasonable the reasons may seem. The lesson here isn't just about not stealing a golf cart, but about maturity and an awareness of the consequences of hasty decisions. Life isn't always easy, and expecting everything to go exactly the way we want only leads to disappointment. A moment of impulsiveness can lead to long-lasting repercussions, and when things go wrong, accepting responsibility and learning from mistakes becomes the key to growth. Nina's story serves as a reminder that, even when it feels like the world is against us, responsibility and clear-headedness in our actions are the most important things. We can't live with the belief that everything will fall into place automatically. Instead, we must face challenges and learn to deal with them in a smart and mature way.